Hello everyone and welcome back to ASP.NET Core 1.0. My name is Steve Bishop, and in this video we're going to be talking about form validation. So in a previous video we were talking about model binding, where MVC actually is able to take the information that a user enters into a form and tries to bind that data to a parameter of one of your actions. That's the beginning phase of form validation, where model binding attempts to bind the data to that action parameter. The other thing that we did in that model binding video is that we checked to see if the model state isValid property was true or false. If it was true, then we went ahead with whatever we wanted to do with that information. But if it was false, then we just simply returned the user back to the form. Now, this is okay to do that, but that really doesn't tell the user what the problem was with the data that they entered into the form. So in this video, we're going to solve that little problem by using HTML helpers to display validation errors. So let's go ahead and hop into our Visual Studio Code window and let's create some form validation. So to start with, let's do a quick little review of what we have so far in our home controller, where our index action, which is the default action whenever the user first goes to our application, it's just going to return our index with form view. Now that index with form view has a form on it that the user fills out, and when they submit that, it comes back to the index action. But this time, since that form is using a post action, it's going to come to the index and try to bind to our contact parameter, which is of a data type contact. And that's where the data binding takes place. The data binding is going to take the data from this form and try to match it to the different properties on our contact class, and then send that as a parameter for our contact parameter. Now, if everything went great with that model binding, then it's going to set this isValid property to true on our model state object. So we have this model state dictionary, and it has this isValid property on it. And if everything happened properly, then that isValid is going to be true, but if not, then it's going to be false. And since previously we were looking to see if it's true, we were just simply going ahead and saying, okay, if it's true, if everything's good on what the user sent us in the form, go ahead and create this customer and then create an instance of this view model, this home index view model, and we're going to take this new customer object and bind it or assign it to the customer property of our home index view model. And then our contact that's being passed into our index action, we're just going to go ahead and assign it to the contact property of our home index view model. Then, of course, if all was well, then we're just going to go ahead and return a index view. And again, since the default action or the default overload of the view method is to take whatever the action name is, and that will be the view that it looks for when it tries to render. So it's passing in that view model to the index view and then returns that back to the user. Now, all of that was happening if everything was peachy keen, fine and dandy, the user didn't have any problems with anything that they entered. But if there was a problem, they were just simply being returned back to the index with form, so they could go and re-enter the data. Now, the problem with that is, as I stated during the slide, the user doesn't necessarily know why they're being redirected back to the index with form. For all they know, maybe the data was entered in properly. There's no error message on that screen to tell them that there was an error. Now, to solve this problem, we don't really need to do anything with the controller as we have it set up right now, because this model state object actually contains all of the errors when it tried to do the model binding. So we don't need to tell the view in any way what the error was. We don't need to pass in any sort of model with the errors or anything like that. It's still going to be held in this model state object. So since the user is being redirected back to this index with form when there's an error, I'm going to go to that form and this is where I'm going to display what the errors were. To do that, it's actually pretty simple. I just need to use the HTML helper, and I'm going to go right to the HTML helper up above the form. That's where I'm going to put this. This is where the error messages are actually going to go. So we're going to do HTML validation summary. And the validation summary method, you can see there are a lot of overloads. There's 10 of them. You could set a specific message. You could exclude property errors, etc., etc. You can do all sorts of wonderful things with this validation summary. But the default, where we just leave it blank, we're not passing any parameters into the method, will do just fine for our purposes. I'm going to go ahead and save it as it is, and I'm just going to go ahead and run our application. Okay, so we know that the ID field is required on our contact class, right? We have ID is required. The first name and last name have a minimum and a maximum length, and then of course our phone number is of a type phone. So if I just leave this blank, which means I'm not filling in that ID field, let's see what happens. So we'll do submit, and we see the value blank is invalid. So it doesn't like the fact that we left this empty. Now you may be wondering, what about the first name and last name? How come they didn't come up with any errors? Well, that's because we're just using the min length and max length. Those are the two data attributes that we're setting. We didn't use the required. And this min length will only kick in if there's some sort of value entered at all. If there's no value entered in, then it's not going to do this min length check. So if we just simply did S and B for our first name and last name, and we're again leaving ID blank, then we get the field first name must be string or array type with a minimum length of 2, and the field last name must be a string or array type with minimum length of 2. So we get our error messages for all three of those fields that we missed. And just to take this one step further, I'm going to go to the phone number here, and I'm just going to put in a bunch of characters here, and we'll submit that. And we can see the phone number field is not a valid phone number. So we're getting some validation here pretty much right out of the box, right? We get all these error messages, and we get a nice little summary of all the problems that were encountered by the model binding. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not particularly enamored with these error messages. I don't really like this. So I'm going to go back to our model here, and I can actually change the error message that's returned by the validation summary. The way you do that is you go to the attribute itself. So we're going to go to this min length one, and I'm going to do a comma, and now you can see that I can set the error message to some sort of string. So I'm going to do error message equals, and I'm going to say the first name field must contain at least 2 characters. Okay, and just to make my life a little easier here, I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it there. I'm going to say the last name, or excuse me, no, the first name. I got the wrong one. The first name field must contain, first name field cannot contain more than 50 characters. Okay, and I'm just going to copy this. Again, I'm doing copying and pasting. I know that's a real taboo in a lot of circles, but you know, sometimes it just gets the job done. So the first name field must contain at least 2 characters. The first name field cannot contain more than 50 characters, but obviously we want to do this on the last name now, so we're going to change this to last and last. Okay, so there we've set our error messages, and I'm going to do the same thing here for phone. I need to add some parentheses here and say error message equals phone number must be a valid number. Okay. And you can, of course, make your error messages whatever you want them to be, but that's what we're going to go with. So we'll go ahead and save that, and let's go ahead and run our application again. All right, so we're going to leave ID blank. We're going to set first name to S, last name to B, Phone number is going to be some big long set of characters. Submit that, and we get the value blank is invalid for our ID. The first name field must contain at least 2 characters. The last name field must contain at least 2 characters. Phone number must be a valid number. And if I went some really strange long amount of characters for first name, we can see the first name field cannot contain more than 50 characters. So we're hitting all of those error messages that we set here on our contact object. Whenever there's some sort of error, we can change that. So let's, you know what, looks like we missed the ID field. So let's do that. Let's change the ID required. So we'll do error message, the ID field is required. Okay, just simple enough. Simple and straightforward. Okay, let's save that and run our application again. And we'll leave ID blank, and we'll do some extra long characters. We'll do B, put in some strange characters for the phone number, and submit. And the value blank is invalid. Wait, I thought we saved it to the ID field as required. How come we're getting this same error message? What's going on here? Well, it turns out the model binding isn't just going to be looking at these attribute tags. It's also looking at the data types and doing some entity framework model binding, or entity framework binding back to the database. So it's looking at the data types as well as these attributes. And it's going to hit upon this being a problem first. It's going to hit upon that entity framework problem before it notices this required attribute. Now, the way that you solve this is something you guys should have been doing all this time. Because this contact is of a model type that binds to entity framework, or is an entity framework model, then we are going to get some entity framework interference with trying to do the model binding. That's one of the main reasons why you should always, always, always be using view models when you're passing information back and through your views. So to solve this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of this, and I'm once again going to do what every coder is not supposed to do. I'm going to hit Control C, and I'm going to go over here to the view models folder, and I'm going to add a new class, and we're going to call this index with form view model. And I'm just going to go ahead and paste everything that's in here. So we did all that work from our contact model. Now I'm just going to go ahead and paste it all here into our new view model. And I do need to bring in some namespaces so that we get our data annotations correct. And we can save this. I can even do a remove and sort. And now I can go back to my contact, and I'm just going to get rid of all these error messages. I'm going to keep the data annotations on here because they assist us with how the context, the DB context, manages the database. So we still need to keep the attributes, but we need to get rid of all these error messages from our model. So let's go ahead and save that. And now since I changed over from a contact object to our new index with form view model, we need to fix this up in our controller as well. So the first thing I'm actually going to need to do is go over here to our index with form and change this to index with form view model. I'm just going to go ahead and save that. I'm going to go back to our home controller. And now what the data type is that should be coming back into our index action is going to also change, right? So we're going to say index with form view model, and I'm going to change this from contact to VM and change this to new VM so that we don't get some sort of naming, or you know what? Let me change that. Let me go back here. I'm just going to call this a response VM. Okay. And that way we don't get some name collision there. But now our contact property on our VM isn't right. And there's a couple of different ways I could fix this. I could go to our home index with viewModel. So let's go to that definition. And I could change this from a contact to that same index with form viewModel. Or I could do something like this. I could say contact. And we're just going to call this contact equals new contact. And I'm going to just use some initial values here. I'm going to set these initial values to, so ID is going to equal the response VM ID. The first name is going to equal response VM first name. Last name is equal to response VM last name. And the phone number is equal to response VM phone number. Okay, and there are actually tools that help you with this. There's a very popular library out there called AutoMapper that will do some of this mapping for you automatically. You just have to do some declarations and some definitions. Now that's a bit beyond the scope of at least this video. I may cover it in a later topic somewhere down the line because AutoMapper is such a very nice utility. But that's probably actually something that's going to be better left for a completely different series outside of the MVC. Okay, so we've got our contact created here. We're setting the property values for that contact, and we're passing it into our view model. And now here with our view, I need to go ahead and pass back in our response VM. So I'm actually going to pass our response view model back to our index with form. So I'm passing that model right back into our index with form, and now our index with form will receive the data in this form again, right? It's going to receive all that data, and that's kind of been something we've been missing, is that when the user passes that information into this parameter, if there was a problem, they wouldn't get the data back into the form. But now I'm actually passing that view model right back into the form. So all that data the user entered into the form is going to be returned back to the form. And in order to make this all work, we actually need to do one more thing, and that is we need to fix these things right here because we need to use the HTML helpers to make that all work. So I'm just going to pause the video real quick here, and I'm going to fix that. I'm going to enter in our label 4 and our text box 4 for these other two labels and text boxes. Okay, so I went ahead and modified our labels and text boxes to use our HTML helpers instead of just being HTML handwritten code. So let's go ahead and run our application. I'm going to leave ID blank. I'm going to set first name to S, last name I'm going to fill with a whole bunch of characters, and phone number, again, I'm going to fill with a whole bunch of nonsense characters. And I'm going to submit this. And now we can see the value blank is invalid. The first name field must contain at least 2 characters. Last name field cannot contain more than 50 characters. Phone number must be a valid number. So we have first name, last name, and phone number all filled in. But we still have that pesky problem over here with our index with form view model where we're not getting the ID field as required. Remember how I also said that the data type is being checked as well as the entity framework. So the way that you solve this is that even though we're keeping the required attribute on here, we're going to allow this int to be nullable. Oops, let's put that question mark in the right spot. So now we're saying ID is allowed to be nullable, which will essentially make it so that the model binding doesn't care if it's a null value or not, but then the required attribute will kick in and it will tell them that there is some sort of problem with the ID field. So let's save this one more time and run our application. Actually, it looks like I forgot to do one other thing. Since I'm changing this to a nullable type, I am getting an error when I try to compile, and that's because it's trying to take this value, which is supposedly supposed to be nullable, and I can't convert a nullable int to a a definite int, right? So to do this, it's actually very simple. I just need to do an explicit conversion so that we're saying, no, it really is going to be converted to an int, and that will convert a null to an int. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's try our application. I swear we're going to work this time. All right, now if we leave ID blank and we just hit enter, you can see the ID field is required. So that is how you can get around some of those real pesky messages that you get as far as an error from the from the data type, is you can set them to nullable, but then use this required attribute. Now you don't want to do that kind of stuff on your actual model, because that will really mess with the way that your database tries to interpret your models. So that's why, again, you really want to be using these view models for these types of scenarios. Now the last thing I want to show you is on our index with form, you don't have to just use this validation summary. So I'm just going to go ahead and comment that out for right now. And instead we're going to put our validation messages next to each one of our inputs. That way when there is an error with that particular input, it's going to be put right next to that particular input label or input box. So the way you do this is, again, we're going to grab the HTML helper and we're going to do HTML dot validation message 4. And validation message 4, just like our text box 4 and our label 4, takes a lambda. So we're going to do m goes to m dot id. And then we're going to do HTML validation message 4, m goes to m first name HTML validation message 4, m goes to m last name. You get the idea here. Okay, let's save this and we'll run our application, and I will just put in some bad data. So we'll do s, bunch of characters, submit, and there we go. So there is the ID field is required. The first name field must contain at least 2 characters. Last name field cannot contain more than 50 characters. Phone number must be a valid number. And if you just want to take a look at the source code here, you can see that down here we have a whole bunch of information that's being put into these data attributes, right? Data val max length, data val true, data val max length 50, min length. So these data dash attributes become important when we start talking about Ajaxy validation. Now, one other very popular thing to do is to set your validation messages as red. So to do that, you can just simply do like a span tag here. And I'm not going to use Cascade style sheets to do this, or classes or anything. I'm just going to go ahead and do a style and set the color to red. Okay. And then I'm just going to plop that in there. Save it and run our application, and I'll just show you that red error message here for our ID. So if I leave ID blank, hit submit, you can see the ID field is required. So there you go. That is validation. That's how you can get your validation messages from the server side. Again, this is not the Ajaxy way. This is not validation on the fly. This is data being submitted to the server and then returning back the error messages back to your user so that you can at least do some form of validation for the user. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe to my channel. And if you have any questions about this video, please feel free to drop me a comment in the comment section below. And until the next video, I hope you guys have a great, wonderful day.